Get up, I think we're being attacked, he muttered. Lizzie immediately gained an alert look and brandished shine in her hands. She was ready. Once everyone was up, the mayor came to the front of the room and said, "All right, all right, all right, all right. What's going on in here?" Norman came up to him and pointed up towards the hole leading outside. "Mayor Mushroom, I woke up a few minutes ago because I heard a sound, and when I got up to investigate I was attacked by a mob, a mummy. I think there might be more outside," explained Norman. The mayor put on a shiny white smile and shook his head. "Ah, son. Mobs are real only in fairy tales and legends. There is no way that a mummy could have just wandered in here and attacked you, and I'm sure that it was just your imagination." Norman felt like he was being treated like a little kid, and he didn't like it at all. "I'm really serious," he declared, his fists balled up in anger. "A mummy attacked me with a golden sickle and—" But Norman was interrupted by the mayor's roaring laugh. He once again shook his head and replied, "So now there are golden sickles? Those two are only mod weapons from legends and myths. You must have had a nightmare, if anything. Now then, if everyone would just head back to bed, I'm sure there will be no more intrusions." The mayor turned on his heel and headed for his own bed. Everyone else did the same, most people grumbling about Norman's antics. Norman and Lizzie were the only ones standing there, and Lizzie felt the need to stick with him. She looked at Norman with an annoyed expression and then pointed over her shoulder towards their great lump of mare. "Come on, Norman, that guy's a phony anyways. I believe you 100%. Norman managed a small smile and looked back as he was heading to his bed. "Thanks. Well, we might as well get some sleep. Or try," he murmured. Lizzie went to bed soon after, but Norman stayed crouched on his bed, waiting for another ambush. Norman was there for a long time, and soon he started to feel pain in his stomach. At first Norman thought that he was being attacked again, but he realized that he was taking damage from hunger. Norman panicked and looked through his chest. There was not a speck of food anywhere. Norman looked around for anything that could satisfy his hunger, and he had to resort to eating the rotten flesh from the zombie. After finishing off the disgusting substance, Norman felt thankful because the piece of rotten flesh hadn't inflicted hunger poison on him. Norman had a feeling that he couldn't stay awake much longer and that rest was essential, so he forced himself to crawl into bed. His head had barely touched the pillow before he had fallen asleep. Norman woke up for the second time not even a minute later. He heard another groaning noise. This time Norman jumped out of bed as fast as he could. He woke up everyone again, only this time he told them, "Come outside. I think we're being surrounded by mummies." Norman still had to wake up the mayor, and when he did the mayor looked very grumpy towards him. He stood up out of bed and held his iron sword threateningly. "What is the meaning of this? Didn't I already tell you that we're not being attacked?" he demanded. Norman pointed towards the hole in the ceiling again, this time more firmly. "I'm dead serious when I say that we're being attacked, sir. Come outside and look," he exclaimed. The mayor stood straight and shouldered his iron sword and huffed irritably. "I think I will. If there isn't an army of mummies coming towards us when I look, you're getting thrown over that wall," he muttered angrily. The mayor strolled slowly and calmly out of a side entrance. Once he had exited the room, everyone watched the side entrance with bated breath. Suddenly, the mayor came rushing back in, his face pale. "We're being attacked. Everyone grab your armor and weapons," he exclaimed as he rushed past the group to unload his chest. Norman groaned in his frustration and ran to his chest. As he was slapping on his diamond armor, he heard a giant uproar of groaning from outside. Danny had to seal up the entrances to their desert temple with bedrock so that the mummies couldn't get inside. The mayor may have been the biggest idiot in the world, but his courage made up for it. Mayor Mushroom soon had his enchanted iron armor on, and once he was ready, he marched right out the door with new confidence. Norman was scared out of his wits, because this would be his first official battle. His feelings only worsened when he stepped outside and witnessed the scene before him. About 100 mummies all exactly alike were marching towards their desert temple from all directions, every one of them wielding gold sickles. Norman was confused and freaked out at the same time, and he wondered how they could have gotten past the bedrock walls. He supposed it might be the work of the error, as that was the most logical explanation he could think of. Norman looked to his left at Mayor Mushroom, who stood bravely before the army of mummies. He stood silently listening to the deafening moans of the undead for a moment before thrusting his iron sword into the air. "All right, you mummies want a battle? I'll give you a hell of a battle. Charge!" he exclaimed as he heftily ran at the army. Norman thought it was a bit dorky, but he joined in with the rest of the battle cries of his companions. Norman felt a significant rush of adrenaline as he charged into the grumbling mummy army. Norman smashed the first mummy he came to in the head with shatter and it crumpled to the ground in smoke. He whirled around to hit another that had grazed his armor, and it backed up into another mummy, who accidentally sliced the victim's head off. Norman felt a slash across his diamond leggings and crouched down to avoid an oncoming blade before swinging shatter at the legs of the mummy behind him. Norman made a chancy decision and grabbed the attention of 10 or so mummies. Once he was being chased. He ducked and snuck through the busy crowds of mummies unnoticed so that the mummies pursuing him became confused. Norman quickly made his way around the mummies and slammed one into another, sending them crashing onto the ground in a heap. The other mummies took a hint and turned around to attack him, but once the front mummies had tripped over the fallen ones that Norman had just hit, every one of them in the group fell in a tangled and angry heap. Norman felt a hard knock on his helmet, and he was unexpectedly sent falling into the piled-up mummies he had caused. Norman felt a jerk on shatter and saw that 2 mummies had grasped the end of his precious diamond shovel. Norman's grip was slipping on shatter and the mummies had almost loosened it from his grip. Norman switched to plan B and pushed forward towards the mummies, causing Shatter's diamond head to slam into both mummies. Norman took this opportunity and snatched back Shatter from the 2 despawning mummies. He sprinted out of the scene of chaos and stood next to their desert temple to take in the rest of the battle. To his horror they were still terribly outnumbered, and it appeared that even though he and the rest of his colleagues had slain at least 5 mummies each, they were still hopelessly outnumbered. The mummies formed groups of 4 or 5 and each group took hold of a survivor. Norman's gut knotted up when he saw a group of mummies slicing open Zeke's squid's front side and all crowd around him like vultures, hungrily wolfing down his organs. This sight severely made Norman want to throw up, but another group of mummies from behind surrounded him and pushed him along. All the zombies had gathered Norman and his companions up against the wall of the desert temple near the bedrock-sealed entrance. One of the mummies in front came up and walked over to Danny, who had given away his bedrock powers during battle after using them. The mummy got close in his face and made a low growl, hiss in its throat before speaking. Its voice sounded similar to that of bones rattling. "Open this entrance before I slit the throats of all you survivors," it demanded, sand leaking in streams from under the mummy's bandages. Danny stood there for a moment, looking like he wanted to punch the mummy's face inside out. After a few seconds of silence he grumbled angrily but still turned around to remove the bedrock. Once the entrances were opened, only 2 mummies could stand guard over each person to be able to all fit inside. The others formed a circle around the desert temple to prevent anyone from escaping. Norman looked around to see if anyone else had gotten eaten alive. He took a count and was relieved to see that no one else had been sliced open and eaten by the mummies. The room was constantly filled with mumbling and moaning from the mummies, all of them muttering to each other in their own language. Suddenly, one mummy with a diamond sickle instead of a gold one shuffled slowly into the middle of the room. It backed up a little and focused on the purple wool marking the center of the room. Norman hoped that the mummy would fall into the trap where the loot was hidden underneath, but instead of breaking the block, the mummy scraped just the surface in the slightest way. The wool suddenly burst into flames, and the one flame appeared on the circle of orange wool around it, lighting up the entire room. Suddenly a scream occurred right in Norman's ear. He gasped and covered it with his hand, then turned around quickly to see who had screamed. The girl who had been saved from the spider from before, Shirin reddest only aura, was being grabbed harshly by the mummies, who were moaning an eerie chant. "Get your filthy hands off me! Ah! Hey! What are you? Help! Let me down!" Shirin had been picked up and raised high by the drying and dry skeletal hands of the mummies. While she struggled to break free and drop back down, the mummies carried her inside the flaming ring and held her above the fire in the middle. Each of the mummies then carefully stepped back onto a separate piece of orange wool, right in the middle of the fires. While still holding the flailing and screaming Shirin in the air, they slowly lowered her into the flame. Shirin was starting to cry now, but when she stood in the middle flame her tears were instantly evaporated. For a moment she looked confused, and the flame in the middle did not appear to hurt her. The ring of mummies began to sing while standing in their own flames. Their song was a dark and evil tune, with eerie words to go with. "The error is a burden, it makes us pay. It keeps us prisoners, we have to stay. Sacrifice is its greatest desire. So we must go into the ancient fire. The error finds pleasure in torturing souls, tormenting of evils untold. It has no mercy or forgiveness. That is why it is so relentless. The error will devour everything in cold. It will kill the young and old. Always loss and always death. Now we take our very last breath." Blood-curdling screaming filled the air as the fire turned from orange to purple. Both Shirin and the mummies dissolved before their very eyes, turning to black and smoking ash. Norman felt more horrified by these events than he had ever been before. The chant and the dissolving of the bodies and the piercing screams ran through his mind, binding his brain in a tight and painful manner. He felt like the error was beginning to take hold of him. The mummy that had the diamond sickle came up to the fires and raised his weapon. Suddenly, every fire in the middle of the room extinguished with a swift hiss and the floor suddenly fell from underneath their feet. Norman shouted in surprise along with everyone else, except the mummies, as they plunged to their death. But after only about 6 seconds of falling, Norman felt his feet hit solid ground, and when he looked far up he still could see the inside of the desert temple high above. When he looked back in front of him, his breath was instantly taken away. They were in a room crafted from pure gold. Chapter 13, The Golden Sphinx. The room was full of gold. The floor was made of gold blocks, the walls and ceiling were too, and there were fountains made of gold blocks that held spraying liquid gold, which was a mod too. Norman even felt his eyes beginning to water because of how much light the gold reflected from the torches placed around the room. Norman put a hand to his eyes to shield some of the light away and noticed a giant golden replica of a bed. It had the same exact shape, only there were no details really because it was all gold. Norman turned round to see how everyone else was reacting to this, and when he looked he saw that all of the mummies that had brought them there were on their knees in a bowing position. Norman turned round and was startled badly, because he met the giant white eyes of a monster. "Hello, Norman Cobweb. I am so glad you could come," uttered the monster in a smooth female voice. Norman could only hear garbled gibberish at the time because at the moment he was a little preoccupied with the glowing white eyes in front of him. Those eyes were bigger, 4 times bigger than his head, so he was nervous to see what the rest of the body looked like. The monster spoke again, saying, "Forgive me, am I too close? Here, let me back up a little." The monster backed up about 20 blocks or so, and now Norman could see what it was. The monster was a giant sphinx glittering with golden fur. The Sphinx was 12 blocks tall, 10 blocks wide, and 20 blocks long if you don't count the tail, which was 10 blocks long by itself. The head was gigantic as well, and Norman became quite uneasy when he noticed the large razor-sharp fangs and claws made of gold. The Sphinx crawled smoothly and seamlessly back onto the giant gold bed. She looked at the group of survivors and studied them carefully. While she was doing this, the mummies who were bowing down to her had rushed over to cater her every need, sharpening her claws, putting new golden polish on her fur, etc. The Sphinx finally finished her inspection and began to search for someone specific. "Which one of you is the leader here?" she asked. Mayor Mushroom stepped towards the front of the group looking hesitant. He raised his hand very slightly and replied, "I am." "And what is your name?" The mayor swallowed exaggeratedly and said, "My name is Mason Mushroom, but most people just call me Mayor Mushroom since, you know." The Sphinx smiled a large toothy smile, showing off her glittering golden daggers. "Allow me to introduce myself, I am Carnpadrider, but I am known in ancient legends as the Golden Sphinx." Norman heard Danny grumble from behind him, and when he took a quick glance he saw him roll his eyes. Suddenly Carnpadrider looked in Danny's direction and said, "What is this? Is there someone who doubts that I am real? Whoever you are, come here in front." Danny instantly shut up, but it was too late. He walked through their crowd until he was standing in front. Trying to look confident, he stood straight and puffed out his chest, but he still couldn't erase the scared look on his face. Carnpadrider's plain white eyes glowed brighter as she spoke to him. "Do you believe I really exist? Am I a figment of your imagination? A hologram? A trick of the light? A group of people wearing a giant sphinx suit? Well?" she demanded, her voice turning from smooth to sour. Danny was beginning to sweat profusely, and his arms were trembling. Norman was actually enjoying the moment of sweetness, and he found it amusing to see that Danny was afraid of something. Carnpadrider leapt off her gold bed and hurtled onto the ground, shaking the entire room. As she crept closer, it was quite clear that Danny was scared out of his wits. Once Carnpadrider had come close enough, she bent her head down and looked straight into Danny's eyes, which were widened in fear. "Do you think I'm real? Be honest, now." Danny stood there shaking and sweating like crazy. He was at least smart enough to say the right answer, and he took a deep breath before replying. "Yes," he murmured. Carnpadrider's glowing white eyes flashed with light and widened as she screamed, "Lies!" Carnpadrider jerked forward, snatched Danny's shivering body up into her jaws and swallowed him whole. Norman could have sworn his mouth had dropped down all the way to the ground at this sight. Carnpadrider licked her lips for a few seconds with everyone staring at her in horror, and then turned back to them. "Now then, does anyone else want to doubt my existence?" Everyone shook their heads no, all of them terrified too badly to speak. Carnpadrider stalked back to her giant gold bed and rested on it once more. Norman was still thinking about Danny being snapped up and eaten like that, and he felt his gut twist up even though he always despised him. Suddenly he felt a hot breath run through his hair, and when he looked up he was startled for the second time by the sudden appearance of Carnpadrider. "Boy, that thing moves fast," she was looking at him with a questioned face. "You want to bring back this boy, don't you, Norman Cobweb?" Norman suddenly realized that she had called him by name twice already. He looked up into her giant white eyes and suddenly felt a strange surge of hope. "Why yes, Carnpadrider," he uttered, barely audible. Suddenly, Carnpadrider backed up and gave a great lurch. Danny was hurled out of her throat and landed in a sticky heap on the ground. Danny was so freaked out that he couldn't even stand. So as soon as he saw Carnpadrider standing over him, he rolled his way back into the crowd, whimpering quietly. Norman had a feeling that this time it might not be a good idea to laugh at Danny's humiliation, so he kept his attention focused on Carnpadrider. The gold sphinx had crawled back into her giant gold bed yet another time, and she was waiting for Norman's complete attention. "You are Norman Cobweb, correct?" she asked. Norman didn't want to hesitate after seeing what had happened before, so he made an instant reply. Yes, Carnpadrider. You were sent here from the third dimension on a planet named Earth because of the Error's plague?" Norman answered the same way as before, not wanting to accidentally do something wrong. "Yes, Carnpadrider. And you were and are accompanied by a girl named Lizzie Cake? Lizzie, if you are here, please come forward." Lizzie was shaking in the same way as Danny, and she held Shine in her hands cautiously, ready to strike anything causing sudden movements. She looked up at Carnpadrider and took a shaky breath. I am Lizzie, your majesty. I mean, Carnpadrider," she sputtered nervously. The gold sphinx paid no mind to her stuttering and continued with her questions. "You two are few of the chosen heroes who were picked specifically by the spirits in between to come into our world and destroy the Error. You have been chosen as one of the two ultra heroes because you have proven to be strong, courageous, kind-hearted, and sharp. These 4 traits would help you on your quest to defeat the Error and its ancient monsters. I have been told of the divination of dimensions, which is a great and powerful prophecy, which says that you must go and defeat the mob clans controlled by the Error and each clan's mutant," said Carnpadrider. For a moment Norman thought that she was finished, but she only paused for a moment before continuing on. "The mutants were created by the Error 400 years ago. The mutants were larger, fiercer, much more powerful forms of regular hostile mobs, and unfortunately such as creepers, spiders, zombies, skeletons, etc. The Error did not invest in all hostile mobs, because being what it was, it did not think that the minor mobs deserved mutants, and so it only created the clans and mutants for a few mobs. In order to weaken the Error, you must slay every one of the 5 mutants, for the Error had inserted much of its evil energy into the mutants to transform them and make them his sources of life. Without his mutants he would be extremely weak, and a lesser foe. This quest has been planned by the spirits in between, the ancient spirits that control all dimensions who had written the divination of dimensions, 400 years ago after the Error had first appeared, and now it has to be fulfilled by the heroes of the prophecy. Do I make myself clear?" asked Carnpadrider. Norman processed this story for a few moments and suddenly a question formed in his throat. He looked up at Carnpadrider and said, "Wait, so how many mutants do I have to defeat?" "The Error created and invested in 5 mutants altogether, and 5 you must slay before battling the Error. There are the 4 clans of the overworld and the one of the nether. Once your entire quest is over and you have defeated the mutants and their mob clans, the Error will be weakened enough for you to overpower and destroy it. There used to be 7 mutants, but now the Ender Dragon has become a queen, ruler of her dimension, and the Wither was decided to be controlled by Herobrine. Those 2 were taken off the list because they had the powers to resist the Error's control as well. This is the only way, Norman Cobweb and Lizzie Cake, our 2 ultra heroes. The fate of all dimensions rests in your hands," declared Carnpadrider. Norman felt like someone had told him to carry a backpack containing 12 pianos up a mountain. Almost feeling faint, he looked over at Lizzie. She didn't look particularly thrilled either. 5 clans? Thought Norman. How the heck are we supposed to find all 5 clans before the Error swallows everything up? It's impossible. As though she could read Norman's mind, Carnpadrider spoke up with an answer to his thought. "It is not impossible, though you may think it. I bestow upon you the golden eye, which when looked through gives you location of the nearest clan. Killing the mutants is an important task not only because it weakens the Error in power, but because every mutant contains a doorway drop. The doorway drops are the keys that when brought together open the 400-year-old gates to the Era's magic prison, which is hidden in the void, will open the magic bonds for you to enter safely. These doorway drops are Era's special items that contain special powers, although their powers are at a limited extent. Kill all the mutants and clans, collect all 5 doorway drops, find the greatest open space facing the void, which is currently located in the end, and destroy the Era while it is still inside its prison. Again, do I make myself clear? She inquired. Norman thought about their situation for about 10 seconds, but he didn't want to keep Carnpadrider waiting, so he answered soon after. Yes, Carnpadrider. But who will I take with me besides Lizzie? He asked. It was written in the divination of dimensions that exactly 2 great heroes would still in their adolescence would accompany the 2 ultra heroes and go on this quest to defeat the Era and its mutants. To keep to the prophecy, you shall choose 2 members from your group to accompany you on your journey, and I mean only 2. This also means you cannot pick from anyone who is of 18 years or older. She stated firmly. Norman turned around to face the group. He ran through the list of survivors in his head. He had left it back in his chest. Instead of including the ones that were gone, he erased them from the list and renumbered the names. List of survivors. 1. Bailey Creeper, and Butterball. 2. Danny Bedrock. 3. Esmeralda Ironblock. 4. Hillary Sponge. 5. Jeff Ironblock. 6. Kelly Fern. 7. Lizzie Cake. 8. Mason Mushroom, Mare. 9. Norman Cobweb, me. 10. Quinn Dragonegg. 11. Stephanie Flowerpot. While he was running the list through his head, Carnpadrider spoke again. I would like your decision within the next minute, so please choose wisely. Norman looked around at the group to see that everyone was looking pleadingly at him. He didn't want to leave people behind, but he had no choice but to do so. He pointed at Quinn and said, Quinn, you can come. Quinn did a goofy fist pump and ran to Norman's side as soon as he heard his name. Norman had picked Quinn because of the fact that he had the power to control wild ender dragons if he were to hatch them. That could be useful in battles. He looked around at his other choices, and noticed that everyone looked twice as nervous now. Quinn was behind him talking with Lizzie, and he seemed excited and relieved. Norman took another look around at the people before him and slowly pointed at Bailey. They would have 2 mob whisperers on their team. Bailey realized that she was being pointed at when Norman said, All right Bailey, you too. Bailey smiled and sighed with relief, bending her head to let her flowing blonde hair hang down. She rushed over towards Norman, followed by her pet creeper Butterball. Thanks. She said awkwardly, not exactly sure what to say. As Bailey came up to the front to stand with her new friends, Butterball followed her and hissed in a friendly way. Norman quickly caught the attention of Jeff and Esmeralda and mouthed sorry before looking back up at Carnpadrider. I have chosen my 2 companions, he declared simply, not showing any sort of emotion. Carnpadrider raised her head and looked straight at Butterball, who backed up a little and hissed a warning sound. I told you to only bring 2 other companions from the group, not 3. Send the creeper back, she demanded. Butterball's black eyes widened in surprise as mummies came up and pushed him back towards the others. Bailey retaliated against the mummies and took them out with her diamond bow and arrows. Norman figured that diamond bows and diamond arrows were just another mod. Carnpadrider came forward to stop Bailey, and she exclaimed, Stupid girl, you shall not touch that creeper. He is to stay with the others. Bailey held tight on Butterball and looked worriedly up at Carnpadrider, who was stalking towards her. Tiny angry red dots had appeared in Butterball's eyes and he began to hiss angrily, warning Carnpadrider again not to come close. Carnpadrider bent down and snapped up Butterball in her teeth, who struggled angrily. Before swallowing the creeper, though, he swelled slightly and then exploded with great force, toppling Carnpadride over onto her back. Norman looked over at Bailey's shocked face, and she had already started crying because of her immediate loss. But when Norman looked at the ground, he saw that separated parts of Butterball were beginning to attach themselves until Butterball was standing unharmed but still angry. Bailey ran and grabbed Butterball again, pulling him away from Carnpadride. Bailey suddenly jumped up onto Butterball's back and the creeper hissed loudly before zooming forward on its 4 feet. Norman was about to make an escape himself, but he felt a hot breath down his back and he was unexpectedly lifted into the air. Carnpadride was going to eat him. Chapter 14, Because of Greed. Norman didn't even have time to react when Carnpadride's teeth opened back up. He slid down the slimy tongue and felt himself being submerged in a hot liquid gold. He couldn't breathe at all, and the giant throat opening above him had closed up, so he couldn't get out. Norman had gotten liquid gold in his eyes, mouth, and in his ears, and he couldn't think. His lungs began to burn along with his eyes, and he felt faint immediately. Doing the only thing he could, Norman took Shatter and slammed it against the stomach of Carnpadride. He felt a vibration in the liquid gold around him as Carnpadride started mocking him. He could tell by the tone of voice, he just couldn't understand because of the liquid gold clogging his ears. He once again was aware that his chest was beginning to burn and weaken, and his thoughts became a mess. Suddenly his head felt a burst of pain, and he realized that something had bumped him. He felt around and grabbed it, feeling the surface quickly. Using his findings, he realized that it was a basketball-sized cat-like eye with 2 sharp points on each end. This was probably the golden eye. He grasped the golden eye and held it towards the surface of the giant stomach. Without considering anything, he jabbed it forward with all his might, and to his relief a large hole was ripped into the stomach and skin, and the liquid gold around him pushed him right out. He didn't even realize it, but the golden eye had accidentally slipped out of his hands. He was still blinded by the gold liquid that had gotten in his eyes, but he could hear Carnpadride snarling and roaring in pain. Norman could have been facing the wrong way from the exit, but he didn't think about it and unsteadily got to his feet. He didn't have time to run before he felt something ram into his back. At first he thought that Carnpadride had gotten him, but he flipped up from the force and landed on something papery. He also felt hair blowing in his face. He must have landed on the back of Butterball to ride with Bailey. Bailey and Norman zoomed back down the golden room and Norman could feel them stop. He was taken off Butterball's back and set down against the wall. Norman could hear the quick steps of Bailey riding back towards Carnpadride, and then he noticed that other sounds were filling the air. He could hear mummies moaning and grunting, the clanging of metal against metal, the whizzing of Bailey's diamond arrows, and Carnpadride's angry snarls. These sounds blasted through the room for about 10 whole minutes, and Norman couldn't do anything but sit there and listen. Suddenly, Carnpadride let out a painful groan and there was a great crash, which thankfully was the sound of her falling to the ground, defeated. Norman jumped a little when he felt another liquid being poured into his eyes. It stung a lot, but after only a few seconds the liquid gold was cleared from his eyes and he could see through a blurred vision. Hilary Sponge was standing over him, soaking up water from a bucket, with a sponge, of course, and sprinkling it over Norman. Norman was about to ask questions, but Hilary squeezed more water into his eyes and they burned again, but this time he could see perfectly clear. Carnpadride's dead body was lying in a giant puddle of liquid gold about 20 blocks from his position, and thankfully there were no mummies even within sight. Liquid gold was flowing in large amounts from the hole in her stomach, and Norman noticed that something had fallen out. It was the golden eye he had found inside. Norman quickly stood up and ran past Hilary. At this point he didn't care about his shoes getting soaked, and he splashed his way up to the body. Norman slowed his walk as he approached the golden eye and then picked it up, holding it carefully in his hands. The golden eye was a beautiful artifact, and it gleamed whenever he looked at it. Norman suddenly remembered what Kanpadrida had said about what the golden eye's purpose was, and he held it close to his face, looking straight into the gold-colored pupil. He started to see an image, and when he looked closer he could see a map. It was a perfect map that showed the exact location of the Creeper clan's hideout. Above it, there were words that read, Mutant 1, Mecha Creeper. Norman instantly recalled the names of the chapters from the Ancient Monsters of Minecraft book, realizing that the first chapter had shown the same words. At one point Quindragonegg walked up to him and grinned widely. "Thanks for cutting open that weirdo's stomach, that thing was so distracted we were able to take her down really. Oh, that's nasty." Norman looked down to see that liquid gold had begun to flood the room, and already it was up to their ankles. Norman looked over at Kanpadrida's corpse, which strangely remained there and didn't despawn in smoke. The liquid gold that was her blood and stomach fluids were flowing out in fine streams, and there seemed to be no end. Norman knew they had to get out quick before they all were drowned. Norman splashed his way back to the giant hole in the ceiling where they had first entered and looked straight up into the desert temple where all their stuff still floated, suspended in the air because of not being affected by physics. It did look a bit strange to see a bunch of floating beds and chests, and someone even had an unused jukebox up there. Norman looked over to see many people staring at Kanpadrida's dead corpse that was spilling out liquid gold. He cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted at the top of his lungs to grab their attention. "I don't care if you don't take orders from people shorter than you, everyone just get over here so that when this place fills up we'll be able to float back up and out of this room." Everyone splashed as they tried to run towards Norman. The gold liquid had flooded to their knees now, making it hard to move quickly. Norman silently did a head count and he found that everyone was here with him, and that Lizzie, Bailey, and Quinn were behind and on either side of him. Norman did a quick scan of the room to make sure no one was left behind, and he stopped when he saw someone crouching down next to the corpse of Kanpadrida. It was the mayor. Norman shouted at him, saying, "Mayor Mushroom, get over here before this place fills up." Norman moved about 2 steps forward and saw that the mayor was filling up about 20 empty bottles with liquid gold. Norman couldn't believe it. He was staying behind just to earn some extra cash. The liquid gold had reached the height of most people's waists already, but the mayor kept on filling his bottles. Norman shouted at him again, but the mayor glared at him with a greedy glint in his eyes. He was being driven mad because of greed. Norman shouted for the 3rd time, but this time he said, "Mayor Mushroom, if you don't get here now the place will fill up and you'll drown. Forget the gold and come over here now." The mayor not only ignored Norman, but he waved his hand swiftly in his direction. The mayor did something very strange and leaned to reach with his stubby little arms inside a major wound in Kanpadrida's chest, and when he came back out, he was holding a giant glowing chunk of something bright. It was oddly shaped, and apparently it was the heart of the Sphinx, made out of pure gold. The mayor held it in his hands and smiled greedily at the gold heart, ignoring all of Norman's shouts. Norman knew there was no way the mayor would make it now. The liquid gold was up to their chests, and for Lizzie, because of her height, it was up to her neck. Norman looked to see that the mayor had taken his own block pack off and he was putting the bottles and the gold heart in it. Norman shouted at him for the 4th time, and only this time did the mayor realize what was happening. As though he had snapped out of a coma, he looked up and around him, realizing that the place was flooding with liquid gold. Mayor Mushroom was up to his neck in the liquid now, and he could barely even move the distance. Norman knew what was slowing him down so much, and he yelled, "Mayor Mushroom, empty your block pack, the gold in there is weighing you down. Kanpadrida made it that way so that thieves wouldn't escape with it." But the mayor shook his head and kept on trudging forward, not willing to let go of his precious items. Norman groaned in frustration at the act the mayor was putting on. He was going to die. The liquid gold had gone up past everyone's heads now, so most people were treading to stay afloat. The mayor tried to do this, but he kept having to bob up and down out of the liquid, because the magical gold he had stolen was weighing him down. Norman looked over to see that the mayor was struggling to bounce himself up as the level grew and they were already halfway to the ceiling height of the gold room. Norman looked back again at Mayor Mushroom, who had just gone under. He watched for a long time, but the mayor didn't come back up again. Another poor soul was lost, and this time it was their leader. Norman wanted to be angry at Carnpet Rider for enchanting the gold in the room, but he couldn't think at all. They had gone past the height of the room and now were floating up back to their desert temple refuge, which was high above. The liquid gold began to flood at a much quicker pace, and after about 2 minutes the gold overflowed through the hole and they were back in their room. Some people wanted to stay and rest, but unfortunately Carnpet Rider had created one last attempt to kill thieves, because the liquid gold in the room began to swirl around until there was one big whirlpool to suck back victims. Norman wasn't the strongest guy, but he took back his bed and chest round the edges of the whirlpool. Everyone else did the same and rushed out of the side entrances to avoid being sucked back down. Everyone gathered outside of the desert temple and looked to see that the whirlpool remained swirling. Once again, they were without shelter, and it was time to seek help. Now everyone was just standing there wondering what they would do. Now there were only 10 people left, their leader had drowned, and their only shelter had become useless. There was absolutely nowhere to turn. Norman was about to shout out to the rest of the group that they should find a village if there was one nearby, but the Danny pushed him back and stepped towards the front of the group acting like he was already the man in charge. All right, everyone. It's time that we stopped taking orders from that blob of a mayor and listen to me. What we're gonna do is... Jeff had to step in at this point and stop Danny from talking. I'm sorry, Danny, but I believe that the eldest of our group should pick the leader that we follow. It's the choice that makes the most sense. Jeff had made a very good point, and Danny looked deadly almost when he trudged back into the crowd while giving Jeff the evil eye. So Jeff took over and found out who the oldest person in the group was, which happened to be Kelly Fern. Norman wasn't exactly thrilled, but at least Danny wasn't the one to pick, otherwise they'd be taking orders from him. Being the oldest in the group at age 37, Kelly slowly stepped up to the front of the group. Jeff stood beside her and said, "All right, Kelly, who is going to be the leader here? You can pick yourself, if you choose." Kelly pursed her lips and looked around. She only had been surveying for about 3 seconds before her eyes fell on Norman and the golden eye. She must have realized that he was the main hero of the divination of dimensions, because she gestured towards him and declared, "Well, Norman here is the main hero of the divination of dimensions, and whether you agree or not I believe that he is now our leader." She caught the nasty glare of Danny right away. "Sorry, Danny." Kelly Fern stepped out of view and pushed Norman up front. Norman really hadn't expected this at all, and he almost dropped the golden eye because his palms were sweating. He had to admit he was nervous now. People just stared at him for about 5 seconds before Danny finally said, "Fine then. Noobman, what do we do next?" Norman looked once again into the pupil of the golden eye and received a glimpse of the Creeper clan's location, which appeared to be in a quite normal stretch of plains with nothing significant but flowers along the ground. He quickly looked back up and said, "Well, the golden eye can show me where we need to go to find each of the clans, and first up we have the Creeper clan, which is located in some large stretch of plains with a stupid name, the Serpent's Eye. It looks like every time we search a location the golden eye acts as a compass and it points in the direction we have to go, so let's go?" It was kind of lame to end off that way, But Norman wasn't really sure what to do at the moment, so he didn't feel he had himself to blame. Norman held the basketball-size golden eye in front of him with both hands, and it suddenly started to glow. Slowly it turned until it was facing northeast past the bedrock wall to where they couldn't yet see. Thankfully, one of the 2 points that was used for the compass ability was longer than the other, so Norman knew whether to go forward or backward. Norman had Danny, barely agreed to take his commands, destroy the bedrock wall around them so that they could see where the golden eye was pointing to. Danny had made it all disappear within a minute, and Norman groaned quietly when he saw that they had a ton of desert to travel across. The only difference, which Norman realized immediately, between the trip coming here and the trip they were going to take across the desert was the fact that now having enough water would be a problem. Norman suddenly resented Notch for adding thirst in the year 2366 for Minecraft Beta 64.16. Either way, they had a long, hot and windy journey ahead of them. Chapter 15, Stocking Up on Supplies and Knowledge. Norman decided that they should set up camp for the rest of the night and for the coming day so that they could prepare for their long journey to defeat the 16 mutants and their clans. That night he added a new entry into his journal. Day 6, June 28, 2415. Today wasn't exactly the best day of our lives, but some unknown decisions were made, so that's good. Early this morning I was attacked by a mummy and woken up twice, and when the mayor went out to investigate it turned out that an army of mummies were attacking. Zeke's squid was gutted open by their sickles, and when we were taken as hostages Turin Redstone was burned to death as a sacrifice. We ended up with the mummies in a room of gold, and we met this solid gold sphinx named Khan Pedrider, which if I remember correctly from Spanish class means rotten flesh, who told me about my entire quest. I have to travel around the world of Minecraft and slay 5 clans of Erd mobs and their mutants, which are giant forms of regular mobs. But afterwards she actually attacked us when I took Butterball as a companion, and I got eaten. I had to pierce her stomach with the golden eye, which is this thing that'll let me see where to go next. She tried drowning us in liquid gold, and everyone escaped except Mayor Mushroom. This is definitely not going to be easy, that's for sure. I just hope everyone survives the rest of the trip. Finally, I have been appointed as the leader of the group now because I am the hero of the divination of dimensions, which is this ancient prophecy, or something along those lines, written by these guys named the spirits in between, I don't know. Now if I make a mistake everyone else will suffer, so the pressure is really high right now. I'm not sure whether I'll be able to handle this leadership now that the mayor was drowned in liquid gold. Poor Mason. Norman Cobweb. In the morning he made a list to keep track of what they needed. Supplies list. 1. 2 full stacks of wooden planks, any type, 128. 2. 2 full stacks of any of the possible, cooked chicken, steak, or pork chop, 128. 3. 6 full stacks of cobblestone for tools, 384. 4. 2 full stacks of iron for tools, 128. 5. 3 full stacks of coal and flint for powering furnaces and lighting, 384. 6. 4 full stacks of dirt for farming, 256. 7. As much sand as possible, optional. 8. As much gold as possible, optional. 9. As much diamond as possible, optional. 10. As much emerald as possible, optional. 11. As much lapis lazuli as possible, optional. 12. As much redstone as possible, optional. 13. As much nether ore as possible, optional for when we explore the nether. 13. As much leather and feathers as possible, optional. Norman sent Bailey, Kelly, Lizzie, and Stephanie to go into the giant nearby jungle and gather wood and dirt, and Jeff, and Esmeralda to gather cobblestone, iron, coal, flint, and whatever else they could find after that. He finally directed Danny, Hillary, and Quinn to scavenge for animals for food and possibly other dropped materials.